Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Cybersmart 2020 Virtual Summit, Prioritizing the Security of Tomorrow. I'm Aaron Boyd, Senior Editor of Technology and Events at NextGov, and it's my pleasure to kick off the next panel of today's summit, Emerging Technology and the Law. Now, more than ever, as the Black Lives Matter movement reaches national prominence, there's a spotlight on the security of emerging technology, especially in policing. What value does surveillance technology provide law enforcement, and how do they ensure this critical data stays protected? Further, what ethical problems arise from the use of emerging technologies? Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. To the right of your screen, you'll find a chat box. That's where you can ask questions of our panelists, as well as chat and interact with your fellow attendees. We'll be fielding your questions toward the end of the program, but I encourage you to submit any you have along the way so we can get right to it at the end. Now, let's get started. Joining us today, we have a great lineup of speakers, including Diane Sabatino, Deputy Executive Assistant Commissioner of the Office of Field Operations at Customs and Border Protection, John S. Hollywood, Senior Operations Researcher and Lead for the Center for Quality Policing at the RAND Corporation, and Mike Senna, President and of the National Fusion Center Association. To get us started, Diane, if you could briefly introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And what does that long title mean and have to do with technology and law enforcement?
It is a long title and one I'm getting used to, as this is my first week in this current role, having recently moved to Washington, D.C. From Miami, Florida. But I'm the Deputy Executive Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Field Operations, and essentially for all port CBP operations at over 300 ports of entry, as well as a number of pre-clearance locations across the country. I've been a government employee for over 22 years, starting back at JFK, and I've been engaged pretty actively in the air passenger environment with technology deployments going all the way back to 2004.
Excellent. And we're going to come back to you to talk more about some of those technologies, including the facial recognition program you all have been rolling out over the last few years.
Yes.
John, who are you and what do you do?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I am John Hollywood. As said, I'm a senior operations researcher and lead RAND Center for Quality Policing. And what that basically means is that I study how innovation in strategies and technologies can hopefully contribute to improving policing and homeland security more broadly. So this has meant I've helped lead about a dozen panels, bringing in practitioners, researchers, other stakeholders on policing technologies and to identify their needs for technologies in all ways, both the non-material side and the material side. I've also done technical and field assessments of different technologies out in policing, including predictive policing, which is AI and machine learning in policing, license plate readers, evaluations of some of these technologies in Chicago and other places, most recently real-time crime centers in Chicago. I've also done some research looking at how we have collectively foiled terror plots in the US and what has gone wrong when we haven't. So if you've heard the statement that over 80% of plots have been foiled domestically rather than through foreign intelligence, that would have been us.
Excellent. And that dovetails very well into Mike and his work. You're one of the places that helps keep and disseminate that information after some very prominent terror attacks. So, Mike, can you tell us who you are and what you do?
I'm Mike Senna. I'm the director for the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center in the Northern California High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, my daytime job. Also serve as the president for the National Fusion Center Association. And what our programs do and are responsible for in the Fusion Center network, there's 80 fusion centers around the country, state and locally operated. And their role is really to help manage information sharing between federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial agencies, along with supporting investigations, and a lot of that relies on technology. So we're talking a little bit about that today.
Excellent, excellent. So as we get started here, just wanted to say to the audience, we know this is a sensitive topic for a lot of people and for a lot of reasons on every side of this. But our panelists are here to have an open, honest, and candid conversation. So we do encourage you, if you have pressing questions about technology and policing and how to do this well and responsibly, we do encourage you to ask, because you've got some great resources here to help you work through a very sensitive topic. As we get started with our conversation, I'd like to go to you, John, for a bit of a table set here for us. Can you talk to us about some of the research you've done? What are some of the big emerging technologies that police are using today? What's What's the latest thing in the policing toolkit?
Right. So in looking at these different technologies, and we're commonly referring to it as quote unquote surveillance technologies, by
Mhm.
far the biggest has been video. That's one we hear the most about. It's one we seem to see most in use. And we've seen basically we're seeing cameras being involved all over the place. Fields, fixed stationary cameras, you put on telephone poles, body worn, in car. Now increasingly usage of access to commercially placed. You may have heard about controversies involving the use of access to Ring cameras, transit cameras, in-school cameras, other things. In fact, we had one chief in one of our panels say that he fully expected that his department would have access to over 1 million cameras in theory within 10 years. Now, in terms of being able to look at most of them, no.
Well,
But
because that
yeah,
flows into the next, the same
yeah,
point here, which is cameras
yeah,
aren't new, right? We've had cameras, we've had
right,
CCT and all this stuff.
right.
What's the new part here?
The internet enabling of them, first of all.
Yeah.
So as opposed to having to look at them in very dedicated facilities or worse, just looking at what was on film before, we're all starting to see another technology coming into play, which is video analytics. So with those applications are find something that's worth monitoring, to cue a human operator. Also can in theory include just stating cameras that don't have anything on them that you don't need to look at. Also, hopefully to be able to help with redacting video, because all these body-worn cameras are coming into play, and various council is asking for different feeds, or the public's asking for different feeds. That tends to involve a lot of redaction of faces and voices. And that can take basically 10 times as long to redact video than it is on tape right now. So anything that you can do to help that is extremely valuable.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like that you started with video because as I think about the different technologies that we see, I cover mostly federal technology angles, but we
Right.
see it in state and local and municipal as well. We see a lot of different technologies from
Yeah.
drone surveillance to facial recognition to big data analytics, as you mentioned, but they all do seem to have a video component these days. That does seem to be the thing that ties it all together.
Right, or at least, I mean, certainly that's one that we really seem to be hearing about and it seems to be using the most. Related to that would be things involving image processing, image recognition. But I think one thing to keep in mind as well is that, and I work mostly with state and local law enforcement, and we have well over 15,000 agencies in this country. They all operate independently. So with many agencies, really are fairly limited in what technologies they have. Even in larger departments, you are always competing with the funds you have available between buy this IT system or hire more officers or conduct maintenance on your cars or your facilities.
So I'd like to dig into that briefly here before we move on to the other panelists as well. When police forces are making those decisions, right? They only have so much budget. They're going to put them into a new technology. What are some of the considerations into what technologies and how advanced to buy, right? So you've got the early adopter to late adopter
Mhm.
scale, right? Where does a police organization want to fall on that scale for usability, right? Spending the taxpayers'
Right.
money in a way that makes sense, but also ethically. I mean, is there an issue with emerging technologies being used for policing if they're not fully tested out?
Right. Right, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, ideally, what we working with departments on is really think about end to end what the use cases are for those technologies. What is it that you really plan on doing with this technology, and not just buying a technology because it sounds really cool. It's the equivalent of a bright shiny object. How do you really plan to use this technology to contribute to the mission, achieve better outcomes, and protect security, privacy, and civil rights all at the same time? And what I say, I didn't really say trade-offs. We need to be able to satisfy all these things at the same time, and usually we can.
Excellent. So we'll come back to you for some more on that. Diane, I want to switch over to you because CBP is one of the agencies using some of these technologies, including one of the ones that gets a lot of scary buzzwords around it, a lot of scary buzz around it, which is facial recognition technology. We've seen some recent issues with that being used to wrongfully prosecute people in American cities. We've also heard about congressional proposals for moratoriums on all federal use of facial recognition. Can you talk to us a bit about how CBP specifically is using this technology?
Yeah, I think to really understand, where we're going with the technology, people need to have a good sense of, what our role and mission is. In addition to preventing the entry of terrorists and terrorist weapons from entering the United States, we're also very heavily invested in facilitating legitimate travel and trade. We are a big part of the economy and making sure passengers and cargo move quickly through ports of entry. I'm always excited hearing about new technology, but also understanding that it's really important to get the messaging right and use it ethically, efficiently, and to advance that legitimate travel and trade. So with the facial comparisons that we use the technology for, when passengers are arriving from foreign, coming across the land border, coming through the air, and even in the cruise passenger environment, they're in a very well-defined space where there is an expectation by the individual who's arriving that they have to present themselves for admission into the United States. So there's an expectation that they have to, encounter a CBP officer and who will then verify their identity. And the evolution that I've seen, really phenomenal over, frankly, 22 years of service with the federal government. Starting with the original biometrics when we were handling with just fingerprints, and now putting the facial comparison technology in that port environment provides a really mutually beneficial opportunity for both the federal agencies to quickly rule out passengers. Having built, CBP builds a small gallery of photos per flight. We're not taking one photo and comparing it to 15 million, available images. We're not going and searching the internet for images to compare people. We have images of people from passports or visas. We build a gallery for people we know are coming on the flight. Simply take an image and make that comparison to verify that individual, and they are who they say they are. It relieves essentially the administrative burden from the officer of doing some of that work, but we put that kind of technology into place, and it really leads to that streamlined and efficient process where passengers are moving through very quickly and efficiently.
Mm. So I want to drill in because you mentioned the way that the CBP process works, right? It's about
Mhm.
matching to a gallery. But for the uninitiated in how facial recognition works, that's interesting to hear how it works, but it might not resonate with what that means
Sure.
for the people. So I want to be direct about this. Facial recognition can be if misused, can be a very dangerous technology, and it has a well-known history of being inaccurate and biased. So how are you dealing with those issues within the CBP program?
I think certainly we've engaged with NIST where we are using a high quality algorithm.
Hmm.
And, we do see, that there are challenges kind of across the universe with all of the different technology that's out there. And that's why we've invested in getting that assessment done of ours, where the algorithm that we're using, the NEC3, shows virtually no measurable differential performance in the results, especially with respect to the demographic factors. But at the end of the day, the facial recognition is simply a tool, and it's really a facial comparison. It's a tool that we're using in the overall inspection process itself. But we've also invested quite a bit of efforts in privacy impact assessments to make sure that we're doing the right thing with the information that we have. So passenger comes in, we take an image of the individual, we make the comparison to the photo, and for US persons or US citizens, we discard those photos within 12 hours of them arriving. But it really is not different than what we were doing before. Officers were always making facial comparisons. They were simply doing it manually, holding up the passport, looking at the passenger. Now we have technology that does it for us that's better than the officers at doing it, and they can more quickly and efficiently get those passengers through the process.
Excellent. We've got a host of questions for you coming in already. Some
Great.
from CBP employees, so we'll get to those toward the end. But for now, Mike, I wanted to switch over to you, get you involved in the
Absolutely.
conversation here too. You kind of stand in the middle, right? John mostly does the state and local stuff. Diane is a federal employee. You're kind of the bridge between that. And in fact, I remember early on talking with Shmendra Paul when they were setting up these fusion centers that the whole idea here was if we shared information about threats, we can prevent future terrorist attacks. How's that going?
Absolutely, it's extremely well, but as we always say, it only takes one incident to show that there's a flaw in the system. So, but being able to pass information between agencies as seamlessly as possible, but it's difficult. And as John said, we're at about 18,000 agencies across the country, a little under 800,000 officers. But when we talk about the success and the capabilities of technology and how it basically makes those manual processes that we used to use, as Diane was saying, where you had some poor person at a CBP checkpoint that may be looking through pictures, very inefficient process. And when you talk about the analysis part of it and the comparison part of it, and there's no system out there that will say, I have a 100% match for that person's facial characteristics. It weights the possibilities and potential of that match. But ultimately, when you look at technology, you got to look at first, most agencies don't have the money to do this as far as buying this type of technology. When you have agencies on average that are 30 or less officers, and as John said, they're struggling to figure out how they're going to put gas in the cars, how they're going to hire new people. And a lot of this, the technology relies on people. So ultimately, you should never rely on technology 100% to decide whether you're going to take some type of enforcement action. And whether it's license plate recognition devices, whether it's facial analysis tools, there's got to be someone there that has the training, expertise, experience, and the understanding of privacy policies. And a lot of times people will buy technology or try technology, and they won't have the policy in place. And you've got to have good policy protection to protect privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties, and define what enforcement action will be taken based on the results of an inquiry into a system. And I think those are the key when we have issues, and those issues do make big news stories. But when we have those issues, it's because of policy, training, and the people. And those are the things that any agency that looks at procuring any new technology needs to evaluate. Do you have the right training in place? Do you have the right people to manage the system? And do you have the right protections to make sure that as minimal as possible impact it has on the community if a poor judgment may be made by an individual person?
And I'd like to get into actually some of those because, as you alluded to, there were some recent news articles about the fusion centers and some issues. And I'd like to get into that and how you all are mitigating those and looking to the future. Before we do, though, can you talk to me about some of the technology you're using, right? When we talk about data sharing, data itself in the modern age is its own kind of new technology with analytics and all the things you can build onto it. But what about the facilitation that the fusion centers do? What kind of technologies are you using to encourage sharing with the right people and limit sharing information with the wrong people or the wrong information and all that?
Absolutely. So, I mean, some of it is expanding technology that the federal government has been developing over the years. National Data Exchange is a primary model of that. Just think of the idea of 18,000 different records management systems, and put on top of that jail management systems, booking photos, all of that type of data has not been shared prior to the last 20 years when this has been rolling out. But even at this point, there's only a little over 8,000 agencies that are sharing. So that means there's a lot that aren't. So a lot of what we do is try to manage and help support the collection, sharing of that data with both regional nodes to collect and share that data to the national nodes within the National Data Exchange. The other part of that is, developing, and this isn't consistent in every fusion center, but a lot of fusion centers are looking at how to use ALPR technology appropriately. Some centers have a handful of people that are doing and managing the access and permission to obtain data through a handful of people in their center. Others are using a tool that allows for auditing and tracking and allowing officers that have the right training to access that information and run license plate data if they have a need to know and a right to know and have had the training on the privacy restrictions and policies. And then the other part of that is making sure that there are audits of the use of technology. And to even greater extent, the use of facial recognition technology, because unfortunately, it is not like CSI, where you see the reflection in someone's eye and you expand that, and next thing you know, you've ID'd the person.
Enhance.
No, not at all. Yeah. enhance. Yeah, it never works like that. It does take time. It takes the right technology. It takes the right access to data. And in many cases, in many states, that access to photographic imagery is limited. In many states, it's just to jail records or Department of Corrections images, not connectivity to DMV records. And there's often a misconception that, hey, we've got these 80 fusion centers and they connect to everything. If they knew how many times the analysts have to log into a separate database, and it's actually people that bridge those together because the technology, the policies, the permissions have not caught up across the nation.
Interesting. So there's a lot to break down there, and I want to jump into a few things. First off, I want to start with protecting the data. So the mission of the fusion centers is to share data. Your job is to push data out there, but as you mentioned, that doesn't mean everyone should get access to all data. There's also in the news a little earlier this year, we had the blue leaks, right, where some fusion centers, along with some other law enforcement agencies, were hacked and information was distributed. So I'd like you to dig in. If your mission is to share information in order to make a more secure country, how do you walk that line of sharing information for security while securing the information you're sharing?
Absolutely. It's difficult. And a lot of the ways that that's done is by compartmentalization. So, not all data is in one place. And in the case of blue leaks, that was, data that was pushed out, some data that was received, and data of those that registered for training and other things. It's unfortunate that happened, but, it's not the first time that government is going to be hacked, and it's not the last time either. And it is that fine line of determining who gets what data. And I struggle with that daily because, there are folks that, officer safety comes first. So our goal is if it's going to affect, an officer's life or public safety, we've got to figure a way to share that. And I've seen greater sharing in the last, 15 years than I ever have in my career. And, times where I've struggled with certain agencies to say, no, we're not going to share that data, despite the fact that it's something that an investigator needs to complete their case. But we've gotten to a point where in certain aspects of it, and we have had leaks, we've pushed information on a known direct terrorist threat where we knew a person was planning an event, was going to attack a certain area, and we felt that the need was great enough to push that out to a wider audience. And sure enough, we had 3 people that released that information. Based on the technology we were using, we were able to find those 3 people and have conversations with them. But it is that thin line because, there's this competing interest of folks to say, well, shouldn't the public know about these things? And no, not if it's going to cause a terrorist act or to, move faster or evade law enforcement or kill law enforcement. And those are the things that we weigh every day. What is the downside of this? Now, part of this also contributes to an era where people receive bulletins and they go, well, this is worthless. It's watered down. Well, it's watered down because we can't give all the details, and that frustrates people as well. Or if it's something that involves civil rights, civil liberties, our job is to protect privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. So if there's something that may affect those areas, we have to have a direct nexus to some type of criminal activity or suspicious behavior that's indicative of criminal activity before we can share it. And that is oftentimes, especially these days, one of the things that we struggle with the most.
Yeah, that's not surprising that's where the struggle would be. One more thing on this, and then we'll move on. Wanted to ask you about the policies because you mentioned those policies, right? It's easy to put technologies in place to put firewalls up, right? To stop people from getting stuff that ICANN, but permissions and the like for various things. But all of those have to be backed up by a policy, right? You're not just making it up on the fly. Because you're quasi-federal and state, you're kind of in the middle and you float. Where's your policy coming from? Who's writing it and who has oversight?
Absolutely. So for each one of the fusion centers, and this was something that Sharminder Paul, the program manager for the information sharing environment, when he started working on this project of, the privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties with Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, FBI, and a number of other partners, they developed a policy template. And that policy template for each of those centers has to meet US DOJ and DHS requirements. And in order for a fusion center to be a fusion center, they have to have a privacy policy in place. So each one of those policies is uploaded at nfcausa.org and available for the public. Part of it is also that, each center has to have a privacy officer designated. So it's got to be somebody that's trained. The other part of that is we have to do training on a regular basis to our personnel on those privacy policies and restrictions. And I'm proud that every time that we send people out to do, operations, if there's any privacy concerns, they call the privacy officer, and I get a call to say, where do we stand on this issue? Can we share this information or not? And but it is that constant, ebb and flow of having those policies in place. As far as ALPR, facial recognition, the Criminal Intelligence Coordinating Council is one of those groups, the CICC. It's under the Global, Federal Advisory Committee to the Attorney General. They develop a lot of the policies, recommendations, and work closely with other groups like the International Association of Chiefs of Police, whose Information Technology Committee. They have a joint IT committee with the with IGIS, the Institute for Justice Information Services, and they develop and promote a lot of the policies that help us out with agencies that are going, what do I do? And if they go to look up CICC and DOJ, they'll find a lot of those policies there that they can look up and recommendations to help guide them.
Excellent. John, I want to switch over to you to bring us back again to the 10,000-foot view of all this. In my day job, I follow policy a lot. It's part of my beat, and I know it is notoriously slow because this is really hard stuff to do. How can organizations like the Fusion Centers and others, how can they keep their policies up to date with emerging technologies? Because the technology goes so fast that it's hard to even understand it, let alone implement it correctly. How do you keep your policies in check?
Okay, so I think going back to general terms, I think even though you have a lot of these new technologies and new variations of technologies that have been emerging, I think that there's a decent amount of commonality and a fairly common framework that you can look at for most of these technologies. And in fact, IACP's Criminal Justice Information Systems Committee has actually been able to come out with sort of a common model policy for technologies, especially those related to surveillance in general. So the first step in the process, again, is to come back to this idea of what are the use cases? What are you actually going to use this technology for? And making sure that there are discussions, not just with you, but within your organization, but with the larger communities, the larger stakeholders, the policymakers, including, I've found we've had very excellent discussions with privacy and civil rights advocates in our panels. And in fact, got a lot of good feedback afterwards saying, thank you very much for having these discussions. It was great to talk to people who are essentially on the other side. We didn't realize how much in agreement we actually were. Everybody pretty much wanted both safety and also maintaining privacy and civil rights and securing the data. In terms of use cases in general, things that have a clear safety, especially related focus, or clear investigative focus that are limited. So one example that they talked about that had a fairly good consensus was monitoring specialized kinds of social media in the middle of a crowded amusement park or crowded event for possible safety issues. And they gave an example of being able to identify someone who was about to kill themselves, and they're able to stop that basically by monitoring social media. At the other side, if it is a case where you're just basically generating and collecting huge amounts of data on the public, and there have been examples, for example, with ostensible facial recognition systems where you just had cameras taking photos of people from pretty long ranges, so the data wasn't that good, and then just keeping it essentially for long periods of time without having any kind of sense of what you're really going to do with it, other than we'll use it at some point to catch bad guys without any kinds of protection policies around it. That kind of tended to lead to trouble. It's that kind of thing. We've even had people from privacy organizations say, especially if you're just capturing lots of information on the public and don't have any policies around what you're going to do with it, much less protect it, that's the point where we really start to get involved. And so, I think, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to jump in on that point briefly, because I think that there's a lot of talk about that, particularly around face, when we talk about face capture. But there's also, I think, a conversation to be had around license plates with that for multiple reasons. One, they get captured far more often by cameras. There are widely used third-party databases out there that several federal agencies tap into that are not managed by the feds, but are managed by third-party vendors. And many of them, as they take pictures of the license plate, also capture face. So they get logged as a license plate use, but they could be used for other things, such as facial determination. What have you seen about the use of license plate readers, and are policies keeping up with how fast those are advancing?
So I think that's something else that will vary place to place. To reinforce what Mike said, we're pushing 18,000 agencies. Again, there are model policies available. Again, the IACP has a model policy on license plate readers that talks about the kind of use cases that you really use these for, and how they, and the policies that you need to protect the data. Again, I think if you're using LPRs for limited applications, and I know the San Diego region, ARGIS, had a great deal of success of using LPR specifically to look for stolen cars, and thus being able to dramatically reduce the amount of time it took to recover cars, as well as the percentage of cars that were recovered. I think they were able to improve, dramatic reduction, dramatic increase the number of stolen vehicles recovered, and then also to get them back within a day, which basically meant the car was pretty much recovered as is, or with minor damage, as opposed to being stripped.
So I'd be interested in your further thoughts on this, John. I'd also be interested if Mike or Diane want to jump in on this. And also, just to the audience, this will be the last line of questioning before we move into the Q&A. So if you have any questions, get those in now. But as we're talking about license plate readers, I think there's also two dimensions to this one as well, at least two. One is license plate reader programs that are controlled and administered by law enforcement agencies versus ones where law enforcement are taking data from third parties that have license plate information, such as things that from banks, from parking garages, right? Again, where the image that was taken was not taken for the use of law enforcement. Those are getting far more widespread use. So, John, if you could comment some on that, and then, of course, Mike or Diane, if you'd like to jump in.
Right. I'd say, I mean, the policies that we've seen in discussions that we have had is that, especially if you're going to use it for law enforcement purposes, the goal is to have the same kinds of thinking about what use cases you're going to do with it, and the same kinds of controls on data for your use, especially if you're using it for enforcement purposes, that you would for other kinds of large data sets. I mean, fundamentally, there is something very different between the consequences of someone in a commercial agency using it to sell you more ads, which obviously is annoying, but it's different from it being used for, for enforcement and potential criminal purposes. Yeah. And I think others on the panel will probably have speak a lot more about some of the specifics.
Sure. Would either of you like to jump in?
And I'll jump in first, Diane, if you want.
Sure.
And the use of technology, especially with license plate recognition tools and devices, there is this market of companies that sell products to law enforcement, and now there's an emerging product company lines that are selling it to the public, and which is an interesting thing that we're seeing right now. But folks are and they're stating, hey, we're tired of people coming in and burglarizing our homes or cars or whatever it may be. So they see this technology as a way to help identify those folks for law enforcement. But it also, and I tell this to law enforcement as well, because I do a lot of town hall meetings about this technology, is I tell them that those use case scenarios are very important. If you're going to use this as a revenue generator, that's in my mind, a very poor idea for the use of technology. It needs to be used for those violent crimes, for those missing persons. It needs to be used for protecting your community from things that are actual threats to people's lives, not for financial gain. And because that's the thing that sours folks when all the technology is used for is something outside of an immediate threat. And it actually jeopardizes the use of technology in many communities. Now, how it's used, how the data is stored, who has access to it are all critical things. And my biggest concern is that, although they won't have the hot list of those stolen vehicles, those vehicles under investigation, which the stolen vehicles is a great function to this. But for me, the vehicles under investigation, for those folks that are known as suspected terrorists, for those folks that are armed robbers, for those folks that are convicted of molestation or pedophiles, registered sex offenders, those are the folks that we want to be able to keep track of to make sure they're in areas where they shouldn't be. And that way, if something does go wrong and we need to find them, that's the great use case scenario for the technology. Now, the downside is we don't know which car is going to be the one that they will actually use. So we may have to backtrack. So having that historical record for at least a certain period of time does help us out with identify associated vehicles. But, when we start talking about the expanded capabilities and having ALPR technology in the hands of everyone in the public, I can tell you that is what I can see as being one of the biggest problems, because they have no responsibility for policies related to privacy, civil rights, civil liberties. They can use it however they want. And I have a great fear of, that implementation of technology in a manner that is going to cast a bad light on ALPR technology, because it has been very successful and useful, but most people don't know about those successes. And even for us, it's hard for us to be able to get that success stories from the people, because no cop ever says technology solved the case. The cop always says, I solved the case. They don't say the computer did it or the technology. So we'll never hear the great success stories, but we try our best to collect them. But it's hard to share some of them with the public.
Understandable. Danny, did you want final thoughts on this before we go to questions?
Just quickly on the license plate readers,
Yeah.
really, and we do use them in the ports of entry, the land border environment. They are an automated part of our process that's really helped streamline, commerce coming through our ports of entry, where it allows the officer to identify those potential threats in advance, but they're not necessarily acting just on one piece of information. That's one tool in the toolbox. At that land border port of entry is, that they're getting the information from the license plate, and part of a larger assessment, but a critical tool to us. And I think with all of the technology that we've talked about, certainly the facial comparison, the license plate readers, there's like a direct nexus to the economic impact and economic prosperity of the United States, because we are getting those those travelers, those passengers, those cargo conveyances through quickly and efficiently, and able to quickly rule out the things that aren't threats.
Excellent. So that actually dovetails very nicely into one of the questions we got. So let me just see here, because it wasn't the first one, but it was like, this is for you, Diane. In fact, most of these are for you, Diane, but
Great.
by all means, Mike, John, if you have something to say, feel free to chime in as well. What is the capture rate of criminals or terrorists getting on a plane versus how much money is being spent on this technology? I assume that's referring to face.
So we look at it, certainly the technology, the priority for in our mission, preventing terrorists and terrorist weapons from entering the United States, are critical missions, right? Securing the border, that's our priority. To assess it in terms of an actual monetary value, I don't know that we could actually do that, because the monetary value, and going back to the statement I made earlier with respect to the impact to the economy, it isn't solely impacting, our ability and enhancing our ability to identify those individuals and pick them off. We've identified several hundred imposters using the facial comparison technology to date at the limited number of locations that we've already rolled it out. But the impact to streamlining, the engagements in the day-to-day with our stakeholders. As a former port director in a number of different locations, the last thing you want to see is a line of people, because we are tied up with these administrative functions before we're able to actually engage with a passenger, whether in the, a vehicle, coming off an aircraft, coming off a cruise ship. And the same in the cargo environment. We want to be able to rule as much information out, mitigate whatever threats there are with the information that's available to us in advance, apply those different technology tools, and really get our officers engaged with the individuals, to conduct any necessary interviews. But the timing, when you talk about the air industry, and the large international airports, they have gate turnaround times, right? And the quicker that we can move passengers through, because we're efficient, right, and effective at what we do using all of these different tools, you know, when just one day of backups could have a negative economic impact at a land border port of entry. You don't want cargo trucks sitting there with perishables, melting because of the heat coming across the southwest border.
So-
We have a responsibility and an obligation to, try and really, exploit every possible opportunity to apply technology out there to really get to the core issues of our mission, number one, and two, really enhance that economic opportunity for the stakeholders, moving through the ports of entry.
So if I'm hearing you right, the the ROI for this is not so much about criminals or terrorists caught, though that is certainly a purpose of what you do. The ROI is in the new technology speeding the process.
That's and it's, it's a bigger picture. It's not, and we're not looking at it at one angle where we're not looking to speed up the process. That is a significant mutually beneficial byproduct of the application of the technology that our stakeholders greatly appreciate. Certainly in the exit environment, I remember, when we first were implementing the process and the TVS with exit and the response from Lufthansa boarding an A380 in 20 minutes using the exit technology.
Mhm.
It's a talking point we still use today because it's a critical and important talking point. Because again, the time that they spend on the ground, every minute is counting against them, especially if they're delayed. If that technology can help them enhance their processes, it's good all around.
Excellent. So I've got clearance to go a little bit over time here. So I think what we're going to do,
Who
I'm going to
cleared
give
that?
I'm gonna give you one more, Diane,
Sure.
and I've got one for Mike, and then one for all three of you, and then we'll wrap up. So, the one for you, Diane, uh, has COVID-19 face masks slowed down the facial recognition applications via airport, cruise lines, corporate and government offices, etc.? One of the things I know you've mentioned is that not only does it speed it up, but it's more hygienic because it's not always, less touch involved, like with fingerprinting. But how has the current pandemic affected all that?
Um, so as far as the passenger traffic, frankly, has dropped off considerably, nationally, and we've certainly taken the opportunity to look at our processes, and really kind of vet out what that current timeline is to move forward. I know with the dramatic impact to both the air, and cruise environments, frankly, with the tourism traffic and the impact in the United States, we have a responsibility to try and engage and work with them to move it forward as quickly as possible. We have that congressional mandate as well for entry exit, but the direction, from Congress was to get exit up and running because we already have an existing entry process. So our focus really has been in getting exit up and running. But it is going to be just a review over the next couple of months to get that timeline and engage with the individual stakeholders. I've been here 3 days. I've already gotten quite a few phone calls from a number of port authorities that we'll be on the phone with, kind of walking through what the expectations are.
Excellent. Well, we'll follow up with you as that develops then. Mike, got one for you here, though it could open up to others as well if anybody wants to comment. Criminal activity also has globalized significantly alongside globalization of trade, tourism, and travel. What are the views of trends, challenges in data sharing internationally? Specifically, they ask with regard to biometrics, data, license plate info, etc.
I have to tell you, it's very difficult. As far as the conversations about international sharing of data has been extremely hard. We've got partners in the intelligence community with Five Eyes, with some of our closer partners out there. But even then, it's still difficult to pass information internationally between agencies. We've seen a lot of great work. CBP's done some great coordination, probably because they've got the best international footprint anywhere with information sharing with partners overseas, especially with commerce. But as far as day-to-day coordination, we do have projects like Threat to Life, where online threats that are being received here in the United States or observed here in the United States. We've been able to work closely with our partners at Interpol, the FBI's LEGAT program, to make sure that those threats are passed to wherever they are in the world. And that program has been extremely successful. But that's one of those rare things where there's an immediate threat to somebody's life, and we've got to get somebody on the ground just to make sure the person is safe and not going to harm anyone else. And that program has probably been one of the most successful I've seen in the last 2 years. But it took that life and death scenario and the world of social media to identify those threats to get that information to those right people. So we are, seeing those baby steps, but it's that level of trust, that level of verification of who's on the other end, and working with our partners that are established in embassies around the country and those that are working in close coordination with Interpol, that is working out well.
Yeah, I imagine if I were to try to social engineer some data out of a local police department, I'd pretend to be, some Interpol agent from France straight out of an Ocean's movie, right? John, what are some of the safeguards against that? What are the checks and balances there? Not just for making sure that a local office isn't being scammed, but also from a legitimate request, right? For American citizen data. What's okay to share internationally, and what has to remain here in the States?
So I'll tell you quite honestly, I'm not an expert on the specifics of exactly what data you can share under what circumstances. I mean, in general, when you think about providing cybersecurity for these tools, when you're basically talking about sensitive data, you're talking about a series of protections, and one of them is defenses against social engineering. And that does mean that if you have regular partners who you're in contact with, you basically have procedures and policies in place that helps them verify who they say they are. Electronically, did it actually come from this right account? Does it have any problems with the message? In general, for more sensitive information, it's supposed to go over specific secure networks, specific secure procedures. You don't just send it over open email. And again, the nature of what it is and what you're doing is going to vary in terms of what networks are at play and what particular authentications that people have to get on those specific networks.
Excellent. So we are just over 1:30. Like I said, we got a little extra time, so I'm going to ask this last question to you, John. We'll just get right in and out of it here because I think it's relatively straightforward. Lots of legislative initiatives to halt facial recognition by the major IT players. So we heard a lot from the major IT players themselves saying that they were going to halt their own programs. There's also a couple of bills running through both chambers right now that would halt all current federal facial recognition programs, including yours, Diane, without extra authorizations. So the question is, legally, where is the line rightfully drawn between privacy concerns and policing activities?
Okay, so in terms of using facial recognition, that's a nice, easy question.
Yeah, right.
Right. So in terms of the specifics of specific laws, I mean, in general, you need to get back to this basic idea of what are the core use cases that you're planning to do with it, and what the implications does it then have on how much you're pushing the technology, and resulting in how much real world error and problems you're going to have, as well as what security and privacy implications. Am I sort of mass harvesting the public's faces as they're walking around going about their business? And I do think in the discussion to date, if one is to totally ban facial recognition use by law enforcement, in the extreme case, that would mean the equivalent of saying you can't use late model iPhones, right? Because I mean, you use your face to recognize things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, looking at the specific use cases and the impact that's going to have the public is going to be very important. So it's not about whether facial recognition technology as a whole should be banned or not. I think in terms of really trying to get into both supporting both safety and security, privacy, and civil rights. So specific things, I've actually got some inputs from some of my colleagues who've been recently working this issue. That the big thing is for departments that are using facial recognition, first, you really want to use only algorithms that have been rigorously demonstrated by third parties to not show racial bias. The department needs to adapt and enforce clear and transparent policies on how they're going to use it, how the information is going to be protected, some degree of minimization, so we're not collecting the world, and confidence thresholds before we're going to act when these algorithms are being acted on in any way.
Hmm.
Another example is, especially if you're trying to do, say, things like mugshot searches, not saying this is the single person. I mean, you've seen examples covered in the media about a gentleman who unfortunately was basically wrongly identified based on a match to what seems to have been not a great high quality photo to begin with in
Right.
any way.
And for those out
Yeah.
there who aren't deep in this stuff, a couple of terms I like to use to really separate all those things: identification versus verification. Right. So
Right.
A system that tries to identify who a person is, rather than a system that tries to verify that a person is who they say they are. Right. Those are two different uses.
Right. And in general, verifications in general typically gets a lot more approval and is a lot technologically easier if I'm trying to say, are you the person who's in this one photo? And you're probably in a good with good optics on both the original photo and we're taking a photo of you now, versus I'm trying to identify who you are from across the room.
Excellent.
The last one comes with a lot of problems.
Yeah. Diane, I'm going to give you the final word here. About 60 seconds before we wrap up.
Great. I hope I can get it through. But I will say, we really have been making a concerted effort to make the distinction between surveillance versus how we use it in the entry exit environment. And my predecessor, John Wagner, did a great job briefing congressionals prior to his departure. It is in an environment, a very defined environment. It's not a camera that's hidden in the corner. You're walking right up to the camera. You see it. It's clear we're going to take your image and what the purpose of that is. But travelers also have the opportunity to opt out and resort to the manual verification by the officers. Um, you know, uh, um, an additional piece to that, with respect to their comfort level in doing that, it is a messaging campaign that we have to do. And we have a lot of work and a long way to go, to carry through Wagner's message, on the Hill to get people to understand, that perception of facial comparison or, facial recognition versus, that surveillance perception. We're pretty straightforward about it. Our privacy impact statements, they're available on the website. They're public facing documents, and we would encourage anyone concerned about that to really invest the time into looking into those documents and how we're protecting the information as well.
Excellent. Diane, John, Mike, thank all three of you for joining us today. This was a great conversation. Fortunately, we are well out of time. And we do have 3 sessions left to go today. So for the audience out there, stay tuned. We've got a lot more. For now, I'd like to turn it over to Kelsey Nelson, who is Senior Product Marketing Manager at Okta, for the next part of our program.